Vaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We are on chapter 8, text number 5. Chapter 8, text number 5. Things are going to get a little less technical here. But it's important to keep in mind that the major feature of this chapter is that the Gita is being connected with a pre-existing tradition. Now, the pre-existing tradition I'm referring to is a body of literature called the Upanishads. That's right. So you could imagine if you were learning about Christianity. Christianity, for most people, at a lay level, most people with just a passing familiarity with Christianity, they engage with it as a standalone tradition. Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He died for your sins. And as such, He redeemed you. And then if you want to get salvation, you have to accept that. And and that's, I think, in a nutshell. And I think that's fairly chaste to the Nicene Creed and early Christianity. I think that's pretty chaste and minimalist and really the essence. That said, it's not a good place to sit because I can't see you. You're good. You're no longer good. However, if you really want to understand Christianity, then you have to understand what? You have to understand Judaism. Because the whole idea of Jesus being the Lamb of God, the sacrificial offering, is based on the Jewish sacrificial tradition, where lambs, sheep, goats, etc., were sacrificed to, a lamb is the name for a young sheep, were sacrificed to Adonai ritually in the temple. They also sacrificed other animals like doves, small animals. And then Jesus became the ultimate human sacrificial offering that was meant to extirpate the sins of all mankind. So there was this, even the idea of a scapegoat, that term, scapegoat, it's an English term. When you blame somebody, they would take 2 goats, they'd sacrifice one goat, kill it, then the other one they would release in the wild. It would take the sins of the Jewish people out into the wild, and the goat would be released, and it'd be the scapegoat that was released, and it took your sins away. This happens in India too. They'll put the sins or all the bad energies into a coconut or something like that, and you break the coconut. It's supposed to kill them off. Or sometimes you'll back a car over a coconut, and then that breaks instead of your car breaking. Or like you get a jade bangle in China, and then the jade bangle breaks, but otherwise your arm would break. And so they have all these. You find a stand-in, and then that stand-in symbolically replaces you, and then it's able to do something on your behalf. Or like if you've got a divorce in your chart, then they marry you to a banana tree, or they marry you to a pot in India, and then that counts as your first marriage. And then you're clear to get married because they marry you to some inanimate object. So there's all sorts. I'm familiar with the Indian stuff especially, but it's there in all cultures. The scapegoat is there. You had the sin eater in a Western European culture, where when somebody would die, they would then offer that person food. They put bread and different food items on the corpse. And then there'd be a sin eater, which would be an outcast who lived outside the town. He would come and he would eat the food off the dead body that was offered to the dead body. We have like a modified form of this in the Shraddha ceremony in India, where you offer pinda to people, rice balls or sesame to people, and then you also offer food to God, and then you eat that Shraddha patra, you eat that patra, that plate that was offered on behalf of that departed person to God, and then you feed brahmanas. And it's understood that then the piety from feeding the brahmanas goes to the deceased person, and they're saved from whatever sins they committed. So, anyway, that was all completely tangential. There was a Jewish cult, a sacrificial cult, that sacrificed animals in a variety of ways. And Jesus being sacrificed is a direct corollary to that. Also, there's Jewish prophecy. The Jewish tradition was a messianic tradition. They believed the Savior was coming. And Jesus then was conceived of by his followers or by himself as being that Savior, that messianic figure. And so you've got, if you really want to understand Christianity, you have to understand Judaism. Because Christianity is built on, it's a commentary on Judaism. It's a revival, it's a schism, it's a commentary on, etc., etc. Judaism, a pre-existing tradition. So, similarly, if you want to understand the Gita, you can just read the verses. However, the Gita in general is a part of a much larger text called the Mahabharata. It's about 1%, less than 1% of the text. And so to understand the Gita, it occurs within a larger text. And so to separate it from that immediate context is going to limit your ability to understand it. Then in addition to that, the particular chapter we're in the Gita is the chapter most dedicated to commentating on the Upanishads. Now this is problematic because if you're trying to understand Christianity for the first time, you don't understand it at all. And then somebody says, yeah, to understand Christianity, you have to understand Judaism. You're at a real disadvantage because you already don't understand Christianity. And then to properly understand it, you have to understand the pre-existing tradition, but you're really operating without a net because you don't know the first culture and you don't know the culture that it's based on either, the parent culture, and so you're disadvantaged. That's next to impossible. Like, to give you an example, if it says Jesus ate meat, then somebody could start to wonder. They could try and work with that. Okay, Jesus ate meat. And then they try and figure out, what kind of meat he probably ate. And so then I think, well, they were shepherds. So they were probably eating like lamb, right? That's probably what they were eating. And so somebody could then, specify lamb. But you got to go and look at what the word in the Greek was that got translated as meat. Kreos means meat in Greek. That's where we get the word creatine from. But the word that's used in relation to Jesus' diet in the Gita is broma, which means food. Like theobromine, the active ingredient in chocolate, same root, broma. At least I think it's from broma. I'm almost certain it is. And so now, why is it in certain books like the King James Bible, for example, is meat? Well, because just like we might say, let's break bread, But that doesn't necessarily mean you could go to eat Chinese food. You go and you could sit down and you could say a prayer and you could say, okay, we're all done, let's break bread. Or you could say the Lord's Prayer over a Chinese meal and say, give us this day our daily bread. And no one would go, whoa, you got to say, give us this day our daily rice. You can't say, give us this day our daily bread. And if somebody goes, yeah, let's break bread, you can't go, oh, hey, you can't say that. Nobody would think that. You understand that colloquially, in American English, when you say let's break bread, you just mean let's eat dinner or let's eat lunch. You're not specifying necessarily the type of food which is being consumed. Or if you just say to somebody, hey, let's get together sometime and break bread. Then they came over to your house and it was Ekadasi, which is the day we don't eat bread. And then, so you fed them a meal without bread. They wouldn't think, oh, this is improper. You invited me to your home to break bread and now we are not. I mean, maybe if somebody was Indian and they didn't know our culture, they might say, you invited me for a meal consisting of bread, but there's no bread in this meal. What are you doing? But anybody who's familiar with American English and our culture would understand that when you say, let's break bread, or give us this day our daily bread, you mean in general bread as a stand-in for food. Or in China, Japan, they say, let's eat rice. In Japan, I know for sure. And nobody thinks the meal necessarily has to only consist of rice. They do the same thing. They take a staple item which is used, and then they use that as a word which is synonymous with all food. Yeah. And there's a term for it, which I'm at a loss for. There's a term for this sort of symbolic language. I want to say metronym, but that could be wrong. And so I don't want to Google it. I don't want you guys to Google it. I just want to move on. But there's a term for this where you say one thing and it's for the whole group of things. You might say, hey, we got to get some rifles, meaning soldiers who carry rifles. And so sometimes you'll refer to one thing and it refers to a whole group from that class. Or one attribute and it refers to the whole person. The redcoats, for example. For the English soldiers who happen to wear red coats. So, if you just jumped from King James's translation into early 17th century English, late 16th, early 17th century English, and then you tried to speculate, you'd be lost. You got to go back to the Greek, right? Which is then supposed to be an approximation of the Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus would have spoken. So then it's a Greek, rendering of a conversation which would have been had in Aramaic, and then that was rendered into Latin, most probably. I'm assuming they were translating from Latin. Maybe they were going all the way back to Greek. I don't know. You could look that up, that level of specificity and information. They have names all the translators who translate. There was a number of them. They translated different sections. You have their names, their pedigrees, and even what manuscripts they were working from. But if you just jump forward, you'd be lost. So if you're operating without that net of being able to go backwards, you're playing it fast and loose, and you're going to make mistakes. So what we're going to try and do today is we're going to look at the verse, and we're going to just try to understand the verse from the language itself and the immediate surrounding context. But we're also going to ground things a little bit in the Upanishads, because again, this whole chapter directly relates to the Upanishads. So we had technical definitions given for 6 words: Brahma, karma, Adi Yagya, Adi Daiva, Adi Bhuta, and Adhyatma. So we had 6 words which were technically defined. Those words are all coming from the Upanishads. That starts us off. It's incredibly clear. Upanishadic terms are introduced and then they're explained by Krishna in a novel way. And so it's extremely clear now that we're linked to the Upanishads. Now we were told at the end of the 7th chapter, that if you know these 6 terms, then and you remember me at the time of death, then you'll go to the supreme abode. I believe that's what was said. Yes. I mean, it doesn't say you'll go to the supreme abode, it says you'll know me at the time of death. So, if you understand these 6 terms, you'll be able to know me at the time of death. Then Arjuna picks up on that and says, how can the Adi Yagya be remembered at the time of death? Indicating the term Adi Yagya as a term for Krishna. And then Krishna explains what these 6 terms mean. And then following that, he says, this is text 5, Antakale cha mameva smaran. So, muktva kalevaram yaha. One who, yaha, remembers, smaran, me, mam, at the end, antakale, literally in the time of the end, in the end time. Anta means end, kala means time, antakale means in the end time, at the time of death. It's a standard compound that indicates at the time of death. Muktva kalevara, having given up his body. So it's very clear that we're talking about death. What happens? Prayati, he dies, he departs. He departs, giving up his body at the end time, and remembers me. So we pretty much have 3 terms here indicating death. Antakale means at the time of death. Muktva kalevara means having given up one's body. And then prayati means you've died, you've departed, you've left. So we actually have 3 terms being used that indicate very clearly that we're talking about death, which was also mentioned in the last chapter and which was also mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. So we've now got 3 verses out of maybe 7. One text 30 in chapter 7, and then text 2 in chapter 8, and now again text 5 in chapter 8, that all mention dying and remembering Krishna. Then what happens to you? Samadbhavam yati. So same, prayati, he departs, and this is yati, he goes. Where does he go? Madbhavam. This word bhava means state of being, comes from the Sanskrit root bhu, which means to be, and so bhava would refer to a state of being. And previously, when defining these 6 Upanishadic terms, every one of them was linked to a swabhav or a bhuta bhava. You probably don't remember this, but anyway, the term bhava was used over and over again to define all the different terms. So now the term bhava is being used again. So sa, he or she, yati, goes to madbhava, to my state of being. Na asti atra samshaya. And of this there is no doubt. In this there is no doubt. So the translation is, and whoever at the end of his life quits his body, remembering me, alone, at once attains my nature, of this there is no doubt. And we'll do the next verse, too. Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam tyajayati anta kalevaram. At the end, giving up one's body, whatever or even, like, more so, like, as a further addendum to my last statement. So, vapi means as a further addendum, moreover, as a further continuation of my previous thought. Yum yum, whatever. Smaram, someone remembers. Tyajayati, when they will give up kalevaram, their body, ante, at the time of death. Tum tum, that same state of being. Evaiti, they will attain. Sada, always. Tad bhava bhavita, they will become that state. They will become that state of being. So, whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. Now there's an idea here. There's a general idea and a specific idea. What's the general idea? What's the specific idea? Yeah.
One becomes whatever they think of when they die is the general.
Yeah, the general idea is that you become, you go to, you attain to whatever state of being you are meditating on when you die. That's a general principle. It's not a general principle of Christianity or Judaism. It is a general principle of Hinduism. It's a general principle of Hinduism going way back. I'm not able to, like, right off the top of my head. The classic example given in this regard is Maharaj Bharat, who the Mahabharata is named after, who became very affectionate towards a deer, adopted a deer. He became a sannyasi, went and moved to the forest, but then he adopted a deer and nursed a deer from, like, the mother of the deer died, and so he nursed the deer. And he got all wrapped up in this deer and caring for the deer almost like his child. Like people get wrapped up in their animals. And then he died, and guess what he became in his next life? He became a deer. He's the classic example. But this idea is as old as Hinduism. It's an Upanishadic idea. It's an early idea. It's an ancient idea. Not necessarily of every religion in the world, but definitely of the Vedic tradition, the Upanishadic tradition. So if the general principle is what you think of when you die is where you will go, is what you will attain to, is what you will become. Like if you think of God, you won't become God, you will go to God. You follow? But if you think of a deer in your text, you could actually become, not that exact deer, but you become a deer because that's possible. So you can't really like become God directly because you can't become the source of the cosmos because you're not the source of the cosmos and therefore you wouldn't be able to become that. So that could be a state of being you will attain to, and that's made clear by Krishna in a number of places. But so it could either be a state of being or a form you would attain, or you'll determine your next birth, or you'll determine which part of heaven you go to, etc., etc. This is a general principle of Hinduism that's so general, none of the commentators actually bother to go back to the Upanishads and quote where the idea originates from, because it's kind of as old as time. I could go back and I could look. It'd just take a minute. But for sure, this is an Upanishadic idea. It's an ancient idea. And that's why it's taking place here in this Upanishadic discourse. And up till now, I mean, there are verses where it says if you remember Krishna and then you go back to heaven, that's there in the Upanishadic literature and it's quoted in the commentaries for these verses. But the general principle is just assumed by everybody because it's just so standard. what's interesting is it's not necessarily standard for every religion on the planet. It is something that's specific to Hinduism, perhaps also Buddhism, South Asian religion. For sure, Buddhism has something like this in there. I don't know exactly where in Buddhism. I don't know that much. I could look it up also, but I didn't. But guaranteed. Buddhism was a schismatic movement. They borrowed a ton of ideas from Hinduism, and this would for sure be one of them too. They believe in reincarnation. They believe the quality of your life determines your next life, and for sure the quality of your thoughts would do that as well. So you got a general principle. The general principle is so standard that nobody bothers to give textual evidence for the origin of the idea because it's so standard. However, it's not standard internationally, cross-culturally. Many religions believe you are your body, and then magically God resurrects your body and takes that to heaven. It seems like just a terribly deficient idea. It's just like really bad, almost like pre-philosophical religion, but somehow that worked into Christianity. I don't even know what to say. It seems so inelegant. Because your body becomes dust. You can see your body become dust. So what do you put the dust back together and you become worm food. You go through you can see the dust becoming worm food and then nourishing plants. And you can see that happening if you look at dead bodies for enough period of time. They disintegrate and become one with the earth. So what happens? That gets reconstituted and reformed. It becomes a human being again, and then that's given, and then that's like sprinkled with fairy dust. It becomes eternal, and spirit literally becomes. Matter literally becomes spirit, when matter and spirit are generally defined as having opposite qualities. But somehow or other you're reconstituted from dirt, and then at what age are you? It gets problematic. What if you got divorced and you're living with your wife forever in eternity? Is it your first wife or your second wife? What if you got married later on in life? Are you young? What if you're young, then you would be married to the first wife? It gets this is a problem for Mormons. They get into this stuff. They try to sort through this. But despite the fact that I find that idea to be almost nonsensical, it certainly is pervasive for 5 billion people in the world. That's the idea of 5 billion people in the world. I think 99% of them never even ask the question or think about it in that much detail. They don't bother to think it through. But nonetheless, that's the doctrine of 5 billion people in the world. 99% of the world's Muslims and Christians believe this. There's definitely 1% that might, get a little esoteric, the Gnostics or whatever. They get maybe some Sufis within Islam, the Gnostics within Christianity. There's going to be some communities that will get a little edgy with some of this stuff. But 99% of 5 billion people, we're still at 5 billion people. Or 4.9 something, So we got a specific Hindu idea, and that's a general principle. And then we have a specific instance of that general principle. And what's the specific instance of that general principle? Yes?
Just that if you think of me in that state, then you attain my state. Not me, but attain my state.
That's right. You attain heaven, you're with me, you're eternal, you get mukti, you get liberation, exactly. So now we've got Krishna introducing a specific instance of that, which is that I have a padam avyayam, an eternal abode that you attain to if you remember me, which is different than all the other destinations of people, which would still be temporary. And so it's both a specific instance of the general principle, and it's also an exception to the rule. How is it an exception to the rule, Hidden?
Because the others are temporary, this would be
There you go. You get it? And you got to keep in mind, Judaism was really the rise of monotheism within a polytheistic society. The Jewish tribe was differentiated largely from the surrounding, whatever, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian culture, because Egyptian culture, because they were monotheists. They believed in, and that's also not exactly technically accurate. They would be called more accurately monolatrists. They believed in one supreme God amongst several gods. They refer to God in the plural, and Adonai even says, you should have no other gods before me, indicating that there are other gods that could theoretically be put before him. And oftentimes, Yahweh is referred to in the plural, indicating they would be the appropriate pronoun for God. It'd be a they, them type situation. And so, yeah. So, but it was the rise of the worship of a source deity, a supreme source, within a polytheistic culture. And so in many ways, Vaishnavism, the Gita, is that same phenomena, the rise of personalism within a semi-personal, impersonal culture, where they kind of believed in the one. Also the rise of, again, monolatry, or what's called kathenotheism, where, to quote Max Mueller, the early Indologist, in the term he coined, where there's this one God amongst the various gods that's supreme, that's the source of all those other gods that you worship. And so, therefore, Krishna is springboarding off of a general principle which was well understood from the Upanishads, and making, you could say, a footnote or a further commentary. And that further commentary is that I am an exception to the rule. The rule is that whatever you remember, you go to, and then you come back again. And then I'm an exception to that rule, because if you remember me, you don't come back again. You go to my eternal abode. So he's pacing. It's very disturbing to me. I'm having an extremely difficult time concentrating class with you going in and out. Just send her home, and that's it. It's done. Now. And have my wife take care of her. You brought your kid? Yeah. Okay. That's the problem. Yeah. I'm glad you're here. Sometimes it's hard for me to, too much is going on, it's hard for me to remember. It's not like I have a memorized speech. I'm just working through this with you guys in real time, and so I have to also concentrate. You have this general principle. That general principle is not worldwide. It's a South Asian idea for Hinduism and its schismatic children, Buddhism. Within that general idea, you now have the Gita as a further revelation or commentary on that general idea. The same way that there was a Jewish sacrificial cult that sacrificed animals to Yahweh, and then Christianity became a commentary or a further elucidation on that, where Jesus became the ultimate sacrificial offering. And it's both pacing the pre-existing culture as well as adding new information. Similarly, here in the Gita, we are now being given a general idea, which is valuable. And so the Gita is really, in many ways, copying or pacing or copy-pasting or being in tandem with, congruent with a pre-existing culture. And the Gita is also giving a further commentary. And that further commentary is also in the Upanishads. And if you remember Brahman, if you remember the One, if you remember the Adi Yagya, then you go back to that place. You never come back again. That idea is also in the older culture. but it's being really explicated here, and it's being related to Krishna here. Whereas it might have been a little more generic as Brahman or the Supreme. Here it's being specified that that is synonymous with Krishna. So in many ways we're getting a repackaging or a re-articulation of the Upanishads, but it's not merely that. It's also a further elucidation. And we're getting new information, namely that Krishna is that supreme being hinted at or spoken about in vague, indefinite, exploratory, revelatory language in the Upanishads. And Krishna is now in a very philosophical, treatise-like way laying out that he is that supreme deity. And we're really dealing with like a full-fledged monotheism, or more properly, a full-fledged supreme deity amongst a pantheon of gods, as opposed to, a true polytheism, or an impersonal absolute, where everything's just one. Pantheism. Did you guys follow that? Okay. So you see what's happening, right? So if you don't know the general principle, then you're operating without a net and you're trying to guess at what's being said with a translation. Because the translation is based on apparent text and more information is being added. If you don't know the new information is added, you can't appreciate what's happening in the Gita because you can't see the two layers and how they're connected and how there's an evolution going on. Do you follow? Like if somebody shows up, like he's wearing a hat that says pray on it, you might just assume that's just how he rolls. He wears pray hats. But his normal hat is like a Trump MAGA hat that he likes to wear. And so now he seems to have, left that aside. Without knowing the way he normally shows up for class, you won't be able to appreciate how he's showing up differently for class today. Because you're just seeing one version of him. And so everybody who knows him is like, oh, see what he did? Or, oh, you dyed your hair. Or, oh, you cut off your beard. Or whatever. Oh, you put on some weight. You can note. If you know the person beforehand, then you can see how they look a little different today. But if you don't, you don't have the same level of appreciation of what's going on and the new thing that's presented. And so what we have to do is look at the general principle and the specific principle, the pre-existing culture and the new statements which are being made. And you have to be educated on Judaism in order to understand Christianity. You have to be educated on the Upanishads in order to understand how Krishna is pacing and being in tandem with the Upanishads and how he's also taking it a step further. Did you guys follow that? It's not particularly complicated. But it would be very easy for us to just go through these verses and not notice this stuff. And if you can understand what I just said, you now have an advanced basic understanding, where you understand the basic teaching of our tradition in a much more comprehensive academic, graduate level. We're going through the Sanskrit. We're giving several translations of each verse. We're showing the evolution. We're talking about what's generic, what's standard, what's being said that's a little different, contextualizing it within world religion, and you guys are ending up with an advanced, basic understanding. Because if you talk to someone with an advanced degree in a subject, and they teach you something simple, they'll teach it differently than someone who's just grappling with a high school level education. They'll have a level of mastery over the subject that will be displayed even when they're doing arithmetic. There'll be an elegance to the way they do algebra. There'll be an elegance to the way they do logic, if they have a graduate degree in logic, versus if they're in a first-year class on logic. And so my hope here is that you guys end up with a very advanced understanding even of these basics so that you see where they came from, where they're going, and what's happening in the Gita. So you can appreciate the revelation. You can appreciate what the Gita adds to the discussion. The Gita is not merely a recap of the Upanishads. It's that and a further elucidation on the meaning of the Upanishads. Just as Christianity seeks to position itself as the fulfillment of the Jewish messianic prophecy, you find a ton of verses in the New Testament which are intended to connect directly to the pre-existing Hebrew Torah and show you the Tanakh, and show you that the prophecies in those various Hebrew texts are being fulfilled by Jesus. And that's meaningful. To the Jewish people, it's not meaningful. They just think, they wrote themselves into our text, and he was not that, and you misunderstood our sacred text, and you have no idea what you're doing. That's what Jewish people think of the attempts by Christianity to position themselves as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. However, for the Christians, they see this, and it connects them to the pre-existing culture, and they feel that, yes, we are the fulfillment of this. They have a Jews for Jesus group, practicing Jews who believe in Jesus, but they practice Judaism. Because you could imagine if Jesus was around and he saw Christian churches, he'd be like, because Jesus worshipped in a synagogue. And he was learned in his tradition, which was a Hebrew tradition. And so you could imagine how far, how much mission drift occurred over 2,000 years, and how Jesus would probably walk into a church and think he was walking to another religion. It's like, where's the Torah? No, we don't do the Torah thing anymore. We got this New Testament thing we're doing now. You follow? It would probably be pretty surprising for him. And there's a group that fills that gap. That gap is there. There's a group that fills that gap. Jews for Jesus. Kind of a fanatical evangelical group of Christians who practice some hybridized form of Judaism, which is nauseating for Jews, but because they end up just when people do this new Egyptian religion or neo-paganism, you can imagine the pagans of the days of old just rolling over in their crypts or whatever, their tree trunks, wherever they throw their bodies. And you can imagine that they wouldn't see themselves in that tradition, because the modern day neo-version is trying to piece together a tradition which died out, that they didn't have access to. One of the benefits of Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world that people have practiced every generation. It is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. So we're not piecing together something which has died off for hundreds or even thousands of years. It's a living tradition which is passed down from generation to generation. As such, there is continuity, and people remember stuff. And there's a very strong scriptural tradition reaching back into antiquated time. That's why when you read a text like the Gita, it so closely mirrors the Hare Krishna lifestyle we lead. Because the religion was practiced continually. It makes mission drift less automatic. It allows for, I think, better fidelity to the pre-existing tradition, because you have more access to it. You're not left piecing it together like fragments from a manuscript. Okay. I thought we did a good job there. We took Judaism and Christianity, which are ostensibly religions that most of you, not all of you, but most of you, have an almost systemic familiarity with. It's almost in your bones that you grew up with it. You could imagine somebody who did not grow up with Hinduism, we eat the body of our God, and drink his blood every day, and then wear the instrument that he was killed on our necks. But he's eternal, but he got killed. And he was really a human, but he wasn't. He was also fully God. You can imagine, oh yeah, it's like a cannibal death cult. I get it, okay? You're a cannibal death cult, okay? Kind of pre-philosophical, because you get that weird idea that he was fully human and fully God. So it's like a cannibal death cult, pre-philosophical cannibal death cult. Like, okay, I got it. They're like, no, it's the highest religion. And everybody just accepts this. And if you're born in this country, when you hear about Jesus died for your sins, it doesn't make you go, what? What do you mean he died for my sins? Like, how's that happen? That's not doesn't make any sense. We got over this idea that you could have someone punished on your behalf hundreds of years ago. That's like practically slavery. That went out with indentured servitude. You can't have somebody else pay for your crimes. That's illegal. It goes against any reasonable justice system. You mean you made a whole religion out of this outdated legal concept? No, he wanted to. Yeah, but that doesn't work in a court of law. Somebody can go, I'll go to jail for the murder he committed. That's not a legitimate defense. That doesn't get you out of jail. That doesn't fix the problem. So if you're not born into a Judeo-Christian culture, hearing about Judaism and Christianity is weird. Shocking. I think one of the most exotic religions in existing. Way more Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom than Hinduism. To give a super dated cultural reference. But if you are familiar with it, then we can build on what you can pick up pretty easily about the evolution that you might not have ever even noticed. But you'll be able to piece it together real easily. And then we can then find a correlate or a parallel within what's happening in the Gita. And you guys that was the goal, is to make it click, to get you guys there quickly. Well, we'll just read one more verse and then we'll be done. Tasmat savasya kaleshu. Therefore, at all times. Tasmat kaleshu means in all times. Mam anusmara. Remember me. Yudhyacha. And fight. And fight. What does that mean? And fight. They're on a battlefield. That context is important. And so Krishna never strays too far away from the fact that they're on a battlefield and he wants his angel to fight. It's interesting now, it's remember me and fight. So it's not fight and do your duty. It's fight and remember me. Full bhakti, full participation in this world. That's evolved. Previously it was do your duty. Don't be attached to results. Then Krishna talks about remembering me, and now he's putting them together, and it's remember me and do your duty. Mai arpita mano buddhir. Place your mind and your intelligence in me. Which is a fancy way of saying,
Devote yourself.
Sure, devote yourself to me, or another fancy way of saying, think of me. Think of me. It's a fancy way of saying think of me. Place your mind and your intelligence in me. It's just a fancy way of saying think of me. You follow? Mam evaisya sangsha. And you'll come to me without a doubt. See, that you'll attain my state of being has now become you'll come to me. Asyasi. You will come. Asangshaya, without any doubt. You'll come to me without a doubt if you do what? Think of me, right? And fight. Does that mean we have to go out and fight? No, we would then interpret that to be we do our duty. Arjuna's duty was to fight. We therefore do our duty. What did Krishna do in this verse? Yes.
Added on that you don't have to just think of him, but you also have to take action.
Yeah, that's 100% correct, and it's a very, very good point. I'm looking for something broader. I'm looking for something more seismic and more universal. 100%. And if I had to pick one thing in the verse, that would be the one I pick. He also says, place your mind intelligence in me, which seems to be very similar to think of me. Right? Of course, if you think of me, maybe that's your mind, and your intelligence is your determination or something like that. You can play with that a little bit. But there is this idea of doing your duty. But there's a more general thing which is happening here. Krishna is turning this theoretical concept, that is a general concept and a specific instance of that concept, and now he's applying it to Arjuna's specific situation. And there's a real sense in which he's materializing his advice. Sometimes this happens. You'll meet with a serious person, a psychiatrist, who will explain to you, perhaps, depending on the psychiatrist, they might explain to you complex trauma. And they might teach you about complex trauma. And then, after teaching you about complex trauma, they might talk about the specific complex trauma that you are suffering from. Then they might further chalk out a course of therapy and healing that they're going to take you through. And they're taking something which is very abstract and making it more personal and then turning it into an actual plan. Whether they do that with you and they explain the math to you, that's what happens every time there's therapy. They learn the general principle when they went to school. When they went to graduate school, they learn the general principle. Then they meet you and they diagnose you within the framework of those general principles that they learned. They shrink you. We call psychiatrists shrinks because they shrink you. They reduce your unique, personal, individual life, and they reduce it down to fitting into one of many buckets they learned about in school. Right? You got kind of standard buckets, right? You got your depression bucket. You got your generalized anxiety bucket. You got your OCD bucket, which kind of becomes its own thing. You got your addiction bucket, right? You got your schizo bucket, different types of schizophrenia, right? You got what other buckets we got? Huh? I see trauma as being a universal bucket that houses all of these specific, in some ways, manifestations of that trauma. But you do have, you could say, PTSD type bucket, like a straight trauma bucket. But that trauma bucket could then be an umbrella bucket. And these become different ways you coped with trauma that happened. Of course, there's also chemical components that could happen in your brain chemistry independent of trauma. So now it gets a little more complicated because sometimes you have universals that house those subsets. What else we got? Personality disorder. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you got your cluster B personality disorder bucket.
Bipolar bucket.
Yeah, your bipolar bucket. Sure, you throw a bipolar bucket, right? They got about half a dozen buckets, 8 buckets. 99% of the people they see are going to fit in most psychiatrists don't see anybody with multiple personality disorder or true sociopath. Maybe it's a little more frequent, but usually it'd be like more some sort of narcissistic personality disorder. Histrionic is there. Borderline is more common. And so 99% of the people they meet are going to fit in these buckets. You get some schizoaffective. That's like you're in 2 buckets. That happens too. You get multiple diagnoses. But they've learned a system then they place you in that system. That's your diagnosis. And they're doing this, whether they tell you, whether they explain their math to you or not is irrelevant. This is what they're doing. And then they chalk out a course for you. You're moving from a general theory to a more specific application of that theory to a more specific real life example. You see how you didn't get it? You noticed a key feature of the verse, but you missed this. And this is actually significant. So what's Krishna really said to Arjuna? He said, hey, you can remember me and go to me. Because whatever you remember is what you go to. That's a universal. So I'm just an instance of that universal. But remembering me will be shown gives eternal life. And so it's, of course you have eternal life either way, but this gives you a permanent destination instead of you just still being in the maelstrom, cycling around. And now back to the real world, Arjun. You got to go fight, and you got to remember me. And that's all you got to do. That's simple. And so there's a cognitive and a behavioral component. I've chalked out some cognitive behavioral therapy for you. You see it? 3 verses. It's clean, isn't it? It's clean, right? Now, abhyasa yoga yuktena. Abhyasa means practice. Abhyasa yoga yuktena. By yoking yourself to the practice of yoga. Yuktena means yoking. By yoking yourself to the practice of yoga. Cetasa nanyagamina, with your mind going to no other place. Paramam Purusham Divyam Yati Part Anuchintayan, thinking of the Supreme Divine Person, you will go to Him. Paramam, Supreme, Purusham, Person, Divyam, Divine. Yati, you will go to Him. Anuchintayan, thinking of Him, you'll go to Him. Now, Krishna is not speaking about Himself in the first person here. He's speaking in the third person, because the Upanishads speak of God in the third person. But He just got done speaking of Himself in the first person, so it's very clear. Sometimes you might say, hey, you need to show up for class on time. Although I'm grateful you're here, and I'm even going longer because you guys showed up like 5 minutes before the bell, but I'm grateful you're here, so I'll go for a little longer and we'll hang out afterwards. I could say, you need to show up for class on time because you need to respect your teacher. Who's your teacher? Me. But sometimes you will refer to yourself in the third person, not because you're some weirdo, but when you want to refer to your office or your title and not make it so personal, sometimes you'll refer to yourself in the third person. You got to listen to your father. You might be the father. You go, son, you got to listen to your father. You're the father. And you can say that. It's perfectly normal English. We all do this. And so Sanskrit's the same way. How do we know that Krishna's not talking about somebody else? Because like 3 or 4 times in the previous few verses, in the 7th chapter, 8th, all throughout the Gita he said, think of me and you'll go to me, but now he said it again, and so now when he speaks in Upanishadic language, it's clear what he's doing. He's trying to connect that third person Upanishadic language to himself. And then we get the famous verse, Kavim Puranam Anushashitaram Anor Aniyangsang Anusmaradyaha Sarvasya Dattaram Achinta Rupam Aditya Varnam Tamasa Parastat. Now he gives a mashup of straight 2 verses from the Upanishads. No, we're no longer dealing with 6 terms from the Upanishads. Which was what happened at the beginning of the chapter. We're no longer dealing with Upanishadic concepts, like what you remember, you go to at the time of death. We're no longer dealing with compound phrases like Supreme Divine Person from the Upanishads or Brahman from the Upanishads. Now we've got straight verses from the Upanishads. This is 2 verses from the Upanishads pieced together. Pieces of 2 verses pieced together in a mashup. Kavim. And so this is a verse about how you should meditate on God. You should meditate on Him as Kavim. And it's become more poetic now. The meter switched from Anustup to Tristub. Abhyasa yogena yuktena chetasa nanyagamina paramam purusham divyam yati partanu chintayan. It's like very kind of straightforward. And now we have Kavim pudanam anushashitadam anoraniyangsam anusmadedyaha savasidatam achintya rupam aditya varnam tamasa parastat. It's much more prayerful. Tristub is a prayerful meter. The meter switched. It's no longer 4 lines of 8 syllables. It's 4 lines of 11 syllables. Kavim Puranam Anushashitaram. It's 4 lines of 11 syllables. Different meter. And that different meter means you're making a prayer. And so Krishna is now quoting the Upanishads about how to meditate on God. Kavim. Kavi. Kavi means poet. Poet or sage. Modern day is used to mean poet. Medieval, even classical. But originally, the original usage of the term kavi was to mean a sage. So, the supreme divine being is the most learned. Puranam. Puranam. Puranam means ancient, old. Anushashitara. Anushashitara means he's the controller of others. Shush is where you get the word Shastra from. Books which control people. So he's Anushashitara. He's the controller of others. So he's the most learned, eternal, the controller, Ano Aniyangsam. He's smaller than the smallest. What does that mean?
Like omnipresent, like the greatest.
Yeah, it's like the omnipresent. We usually say he's the biggest, right? That's how we glorify. So in Sanskrit, you'll glorify by saying he's the biggest and he's also the smallest. The Alpha and the Omega. The beginning, middle, and end of all things. The finest. You have a little bit of this like with the Holy Spirit or God existing within everything. Sometimes sophisticated Christian theologians in the last couple hundred years, they say that God is the ground of being. The ground of being. He's the unseen substratum of all reality.
Would that be synonymous with monad, or with the concept of
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of like a monadistic concept for sure, yeah. Leibniz taught a philosophy which is commonly now known as monadism, and so he's referencing that, right? Yeah. And so you've got this idea that God is the ground of being the substrate of all reality, finer than the finest, more subtler than the subtlest, in all things, omnipresent. Very good. Anusmadet yaha. One should meditate in this way. Anusmadet means you should do this. One should do this. It's optative. Sarvasya Dataram. He's maintaining everything. Maintaining everything. He's smaller than the smallest, and he's maintaining everything. He's the controller, and he's smaller than the smallest. You see the plays? Right? He's maintaining everything, Sarvasya Dataram, and Achintya Rupam. He has an inconceivable form. Now we like this. Why do we like he has an inconceivable form? Why do we like that? I'm super disappointed if you guys can't answer this question like that. Like I'm like instant fail for every devotee who can't answer this question without any hesitation. No, you don't get to answer. You answer the question. Why do we like the statement Krishna has an inconceivable form? It doesn't have to be both words. It can be just one word. Why do we like that statement?
Because he's just a person who's got a form.
That's right. Inconceivable, conceivable is less relevant. We like to hear that Krishna has a form. Because if Krishna has a form, you can love Krishna. If Krishna is formless, then he's not conscious. Consciousness inheres within a form. And so a formless deity starts to become an unconscious deity, definitely becomes an unloving deity, and starts to become an unlovable deity. And so personalism, Vaishnavism, is all based on the idea that the highest apex, the zenith of realization, God has a form. It may be tamasa parastat, beyond darkness, aditya varnam, brilliant like the sun, achintya rupam, an inconceivable form, but it's a form nonetheless. It says you should meditate on God as having a form, and it's a verse from the Upanishads which says that God has a form. And therefore we find our tradition within this older text. The tradition which teaches about the Paramam Purusham Divyam, the supreme divine person. Literally it means the supreme divine person. Purusha means person. And so we have our tradition here, in the older tradition, that you should meditate on God. Meditate on God replete with all these wonderful divine transcendental attributes. And the one which is most important for us is the idea that he has a divine form. Beyond tamasa parastat, beyond the darkness, beyond illusion, beyond ignorance, beyond matter. It's a spiritual form. Aditya varnam, brilliant like the sun. More than the sun, Sanjay says, if you saw thousands of suns rising at one time, that might be like Krishna's effulgence. And so it's a beautiful verse from the Upanishads. And again, this theme that we've gotten, technical terms from the Upanishads, and those terms are being worked with by Krishna to explicate like a very precise teaching that's congruent with the Upanishads, but is more clear, where we're moving from a third person to a first person. We're moving into a personal deity. Then there's concepts from the Upanishads. What's a concept from the Upanishads? Answer now. You can do it, guys. Come on, you can do it. What is it?
What you think of.
That what you think of will happen when you die. And then there's an application of that concept. There's a specific instance of that concept. What's a specific instance of that concept? You think of me and you'll go to heaven forever, right? It's an evolution. But it's not really an evolution because these ideas are there in the Upanishads. They just may be being made more clear and more systematic here, whereas the Upanishads are more chaotic and revelatory. Then that gets made even more practical. Do your duty, fight, and remember me. Then we get some more Upanishadic language with the practice of yoga, placing the mind and the heart on me, thinking of me, and then you'll attain the supreme divine person that's spoken of in the Upanishads. That's an Upanishadic term. And then straight verses from the Upanishads about the qualities of that person that you're supposed to be thinking of, telling you how to meditate. It says, here, you should think of him. Anuchintaya. You should think of him. It says it here. Anusmara. You should think of him. It says this. Mam smara. You remember me. Sarveshu kaleshu. At all times, including antakale, at the time of death. And then yati. You will go to me. Esyasi. You will come to me. Okay, but what do you mean when you say think of you, Krishna? I mean think of me as Kavi, Purana, Anushashitara, as the controller, as the most learned, as the ancient, Anoranyangsan, as omnipresent, as the finest. Anusmartya, you should remember me like that. Sarvasiddhataram, maintaining everything. Achintya rupam, in an inconceivable form. Adityavanam, brilliant like the sun. Tamasa parastat, beyond all darkness. And now you get the idea, in contrast to the ridiculously simpleton Christian idea that you become dust and then God sort of like makes you into a mud like sandcastle and takes you back to heaven as a sandcastle, as a reconstituted sandcastle. You get this idea that Krishna has a form which is beyond matter, a spiritual form, an eternal form. And you get ideas of how to meditate on God. Beautiful, isn't it? Very Upanishadic. Very Upanishadic. And if that wasn't enough, and this is just because you guys showed up late, I don't want to disappoint. Prayana Kale, at the time of death, Manasa Achalena, with an undeviating mind, with an unmoving mind. Bhaktya Yukto, yoked with bhakti. Bhaktya Yukto, yoked with bhakti. Yoga Balenacha, and by the strength of that yoga. Bruvor Madhye Pranam Avesha Samyak, with your prana placed properly between your eyebrows. Satam Param Parusham Upaiti Divyam, you will attain that supreme divine person. What do we like about this verse? Answer immediately.
It tells you how to do it when you die.
Nope. What do we like about this verse?
Further connects to the Upanishadic teaching.
Nope. What do we like about this verse?
The divine person.
Nope. What do we like about this verse? It says bhakti. Bhaktya yukto. It says with bhakti. The divine person was mentioned in the two verses earlier. So we like it, but we've already got that one. What'd you say?
Does it describe, teaches you how to think of him?
Sure, but many verses have said that, including the previous verse, which told you how to meditate on God, do your duty, and remember me. We got many verses like that. This is one of many verses like this about placing your prana in between your eyebrows. But it's also very Upanishadic. And yes, it does further connect with the Upanishads. You are not wrong. But what do we love about this verse? You guys didn't see it? He says, Bhaktya yukto. Yoked with bhakti. Together with bhakti. Indicating that your bhakti, that your love for Krishna, is a critical element of your meditation on Krishna and your thoughts of Krishna. With Krishna, who has a form, which is beyond all matter, and which is brilliant like the sun, and which is finer than the finest, and which is the supreme form. And you're meditating on that form with bhakti. You see? You see it. It's here. That word bhakti is not so much used in the Upanishads. It's not that it doesn't exist ever in the Upanishads, but not like the Gita. And so that's one of those elements that's being put in here. Just like when Krishna's saying, I am that supreme divine person. Remember me, remember him. Remember me, remember him. I am him, which he'll say explicitly later on. Now the idea of bhakti being a term which describes the Upanishadic system for attaining transcendence. That's a very important evolution. You see it now? You feel stupid for missing it?
Yeah.
You should. You feel dumb?
Yeah.
Good. You feel dumb? Good. I want you to feel dumb. You know why I want you to feel dumb?
So we can remember it for next time.
So you'll remember it, and so you'll start to learn to look properly. I'm giving you the verses. You're reading along with me, and I'm saying, Bhaktya yukto. I said super loud. I said, with bhakti. Yoked to bhakti. With bhakti. Like I said it multiple times, so you guys would hear it. Bhaktya, with bhakti. I made it really clear, right? You guys have to learn how to look and see, because those things are there. They're there. They're ultimately there in the Upanishads. but they're made really easy to follow in the Gita. But if you can't find them in the Gita, what hope do you have of finding them in the Upanishads? You follow? This is low-hanging fruit. It's right there. You get it? This is just right there for you. It's easy for you. You guys can do it. We got to become miners. We have to become expert. We have to learn to see these terms, see how the ideas are developing over time. Learn how to mine the text. We're not reading into it in the sense of trying to take some artificial teaching and affix it to the Gita. It's there in the Gita. It's easy to see. You just have to look a little careful. It's not free, but it's not difficult. Okay, thank you, IGTV. Feedback? Yes?
This wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed the first part, was completely elucidating, and then